materials for park rangers and interprets across the entire park system. He studies the history of abolition, the coming of the Civil War, and the impact of the war on everyday Americans. His focus also includes racial dynamics in the aftermath of emancipation. Rudy holds a Master's of Art in Applied History from Shippensburg University and a Bachelor's of Art in History with a minor in Civil War era studies from Gettysburg College. He also teaches undergraduate courses as an adjunct instructor in the Civil War Study Department at Gettysburg College. So, John, if you would like to get started, if I missed anything in the introduction, please feel free to add. But
No,
thank you for being here.
you made me sound much better than I am, Shantanique. So thank you. I always feel embarrassed when anyone reads that introduction because I'm like, are they overselling me? Is Shantanique overselling me? So I'm really excited to be here and chatting with you tonight. And I'm really excited to have you in this virtual classroom that we've got going here online. I know it's not as fun as being out on the campus, not as fun as visiting Gettysburg itself, but what it means is that I can take you to a bunch of different places that it would take us a long time to walk to. And that means that we can see a lot more than we might have gotten to see and talk about a lot more cool stories and amazing stories that have to do with this place and its century of racial dynamics after the Civil War. And really that's where a lot of my research has been since I graduated from Gettysburg in 2007, is looking at how race and the Civil War memory of Gettysburg collide. And part of it is that, I look at Gettysburg, I live here now, I live in Adams County, and I look at Gettysburg and it reminds me of this, this quote from Ocean's 13. I know that's really random, but there's the two characters and there's a moment of betrayal and Reuben says to the guy who portrays him, you shook Sinatra's hand, and there's a code of honor among guys who shook Sinatra's hand. And I look at Gettysburg and I sit here and go, you shook Lincoln's hand. Like, there's a code of honor among people who shook Lincoln's hand. It's, to me, I live in Gettysburg and I came to Gettysburg as a student, and I've come to this realization that Gettysburg, you should have known better. Gettysburg is no more racist than any other town in the American North. From 1865 on forward. It's exactly the same as every other town around it, except that giant battle happened here. This tonight is the 150 7th, don't check my math, anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. It's the end of the battle, when the Confederacy was defeated here, when the downward slope of the war started, the turning point of the war. Sorry, Vicksburg, I apologize to anybody out there from Vicksburg, but this is the point where everything shifts and changes. And our landscape was covered with the detritus of that war too. And actually, a lot of my research started right here, right in this place you see, right on the screen. And it started around a few of the characters that were on the Gettysburg College campus during the battle. One of them was a man named Jack Hopkins. Jack Hopkins was the janitor of the college, and this night, July 3rd, he was nowhere near the college as the battle was winding down. Jack Hopkins was the janitor. Jack Hopkins was in charge of ringing the college bell. He was in charge of keeping these orchards spick and span and the grass cut and everything you see here clean and tidy. But he couldn't afford to be in town because he and his entire family had to leave. They were Black. Jack Hopkins, his wife Julia, their son Edward, all flee because Pennsylvania College, now Gettysburg College, became a Confederate field hospital. It wasn't safe to be there. And when the Hopkins family returned to this campus, they found new things had popped up in their front lawn. They lived in a building just behind those three buildings there, just behind Pennsylvania Hall. They found graves. Their yard was now a graveyard. It was men that died inside Pennsylvania Hall, Confederate soldiers. They were planted in the backyard. I know 9 names of Confederates. I'm not going to bore you with all their details, but 9 names of Confederates who were buried back there, who had headboards that were recorded. Of those 9, I can find 6 in the United States Census for 1860. So I know where they lived, who their parents were, what their lives were like before the Civil War, before they died at Gettysburg. Of those 6, all 6 of those Confederate soldiers either owned slaves themselves, come from slaveholding families, or live in slaveholding households. 6 out of 6. Jack Hopkins, the janitor, has to clean that yard every day. That's his job. Keep the campus tidy. His son, Edward Hopkins, he's college age, but he doesn't go to the college because he's Black. He works for a living down in town, and every day he leaves the house after they come back, after the battle, after they find every piece of their life destroyed and broken, their bed sheets torn up and used for bandages to stop or the wounds of Confederates. This Black family living in the midst of that Confederate graveyard. Edward Hopkins walks out the door every day. He walks down to his job in a hotel down in town as a waiter, and then walks back across the campus every night. And every time he passes by those graves, Edward Hopkins is dreaming of owning his own restaurant someday. But throughout the fall of 1863, he's walking by those graves. They're a constant reminder of the war that's going on. And that war is about the definition of people that have the same skin color as him, whether Black men and women in America are citizens or not. July, August, he walks past the graves. September, October, he walks past the graves. November comes and Gettysburg shakes Lincoln's hand. He's still walking past those graves. November, December, January, he walks out the door, and instead of heading down into town, he walks past those graves one more time, those graves of slaveholders, and walks north out of town with some friends. They go north to Carlisle, and they join the United States Colored Troops. U.S. Colored Troops are the African-American soldiers in the American Civil War. They're not fighting for any particular state. They're fighting for their country. And I have to wonder, is it those graves? Is it those graves that push him to do that? Since I've gotten to know Edward Hopkins, this amazing man, I've wanted to know him. I've wanted to see him. And I thought for a long time I never would have that chance. Never would be able to see into his eyes. But I'm a geek, and sometimes I hang out at the Adams County Historical Society, and I dig through too many folders. And one day I was digging through a folder and I found this. It's a stereo view. If you cross your eyes just right, you can make it pop out at you. It's from a fishing club trip in 1880, the Sioux Fishing Club. You can see it right there. And this is view number 9. If you can see the halfway down that left-hand side there, Castle Hopkins Kitchen, Hopkins Kadori. That's Edward Hopkins right there. Edward Hopkins was the cook for this particular fishing camp, fishing club excursion. He's in the newspaper noted as the cook, the guy who's going along. Remember, he wanted to run that restaurant. He loves cooking. There's Edward Hopkins. Ed Hopkins' life during the Civil War is something we focus on. We love the Civil War. We love looking at this war. But when you start looking beyond the war, when you start looking more at what happened afterwards, the story becomes more complex and more interesting and more vivid and more exciting, and really is a story of a ton of heroes who are fighting against a system that is trying to tear them down. Ed Hopkins right there. He gets that oyster saloon. Same year this picture is taken. He opens his restaurant. Here's a note in the paper from February of 1880. Edward Hopkins has opened an oyster saloon in McConaughey's Hall, lately kept by William Biddle, where he will furnish the best oysters to be had in the Baltimore market, done up in every style. Oysters in the shell, always on hand. He asks a share of public patronage. Hopkins achieved his dream. A decade and a half after the Civil War, he's finally got his restaurant. But that wasn't the only interesting dream that Ed Hopkins fulfilled in 1880. Near that ad in the same newspaper is this article as well. In Cumberland Township, adjoining Gettysburg, the Republican leaders had a colored brother placed upon their ticket for clerk. Result, white Republicans refused to endorse the program and so effectually scratched as ascended up after the Woodbine. And more, whilst the township has been decidedly Republican, the Democrats get the assessor and the supervisor, both school directors and the clerk, the last named by a 26 majority. Cumberland Township, African Americans in that township, and that's the township that circles Gettysburg on three sides. It's where most of the battle happened, and it's where the majority of the black farmers in Gettysburg lived at the time of the battle. They tried, and they failed. But then see the next paragraph down. In the third ward of this borough, the Republican managers arranged the matter differently. They also placed a colored man and brother on their ticket, but took the precaution to put him where he could not be defeated for inspector. Now, it's inspector of the polls. He'd be in charge of making sure that the election in the third ward runs properly. Many white Republicans objected, and some put their protests in substantial shape, but the program went through. Who claims the credit? Don't all speak at once. You can tell this is the Democratic newspaper, the newspaper that during the Civil War was vehemently against the Emancipation Proclamation, vehemently against enslaved African Americans rising up. See that next one down too? What capital slave drivers the white and black Republican leaders of the Third Ward would have made were not the former most responsible for the bulldozing practice at the polls on Tuesday. Certainly it was done to please them. Wasn't by their advice comes the inquiry. The white establishment in Gettysburg couldn't caution the fact that in the Third Ward, which is predominantly black at this period and up to today too, the black core of Gettysburg, they couldn't caution the fact that they might want a black person on the ticket, that they might want an African-American man to hold an office. They obviously had to be forced to vote that way. And when you run down the poll results, you can see here, Third Ward, blah, 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 Burgess, Town Council, Judge. Then you come down here to the most important one, Inspector, 3/4 of the way down. The votes are 72 to 91 in favor of Edward Hopkins, that black man who fought in the Civil War, who dreamed of opening a restaurant, whose father was the janitor of Pennsylvania College. He has now become Gettysburg's first elected official of color. And if you look at those vote totals, even though the Democrats are saying that a lot of the Republicans refused to vote for him, they're not that far off of anybody else. 94 for this office, 88 for that office, 93 for this office, and Ed Hopkins got 91. He's the first black elected official, but he's not the last. He starts something huge in this moment. He starts something massive. This is what happens. With Ed Hopkins' political homesteading, where he homesteads in an office where he block breaks. In 1883, Isaac Carter from the 127th United States Colored Troops, he becomes the inspector of the polls. In 1884, Edward Hopkins becomes inspector of the polls again. 1885, Henry Reister, another black man from the Third Ward, becomes inspector of the polls. 1886 and 1888, William A. Thompson, one of Edward Hopkins' friends from the 25th United States Colored Troops, he becomes the inspector of the polls. In 89, it's George Isnick, and then 1890, Edward Hopkins is elected one more time as inspector of the polls. But he doesn't get to serve. He died that year. He died in 1890. Gettysburg's pioneer, all but forgotten. And Gettysburg's history is full of these all but forgotten heroes, and who are remembered for one thing, but should be remembered for more. This is a really famous photograph. I don't know how many of you have seen it. Right down there center, you see that couple right dead center in the picture? That is the Biggs family. That's Basil Biggs on the left-hand side. Basil Biggs is celebrated in Gettysburg's Black history. Basil Biggs is the man who leads the reburial cruise after the Battle of Gettysburg. He and the Black laborers of Gettysburg gently lift every body out of the graves, every federal body, every United States soldier out of the graves around the battlefield, place them into pine boxes. If there's a gravestone with them, they nail that gravestone. It's usually made out of wood carved by one of that guy's comrades to the lid, and then they put it in a wagon and it's taken up to the cemetery and reburied in the National Cemetery. Basil Biggs buys and enlarges this farm, the Fry Farm, the farm behind him, which is right behind where Pickett's charge crashed this night. He buys that farm thanks to what he gets from reburying the dead. After the battle, Black men literally found new opportunity because of those dead soldiers. But Basil Biggs' story doesn't stop there either. Basil Biggs' story gets really, really, really intriguing, especially in 1870. In 1870, this is the first year that Black men can vote in the state of Pennsylvania since the 1830s. Okay, I just shocked you, right? Because you think, Pennsylvania's the North. This is where there's freedom, right? Actually, there's not. In the 1830s, the state of Pennsylvania changed the state constitution and barred Black men from voting. There's an entire generation of Black men who have never voted, who live in Gettysburg, who now, because of the post-war amendments, because of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, have had their entire life changed. And now they can't have the ballot taken from them because of their race. One of them is a man named Otho Johnston. He lives in the county almshouse, which is up north of Gettysburg, out just beyond the campus. Otho Johnston lives out there. Johnston wanted to vote. Johnston was looking forward to it. Johnston was sitting in the almshouse, waiting. He's waiting to vote. No one took him. He needed permission to leave the almshouse. If you wanted to go, you needed the caretaker, Jonas Johns, to approve you leaving the building. No one approved Otho Johnston leaving. That's because down at the Cumberland Township polling place, which was now where the restaurant down in the south end of town, the Dobbin House. The Dobbin House is today. That's the polling place in 1870's election. Down there, where all of the Black folks in the township are working to make sure that all of these brand new voters get the chance to vote, Basil Biggs is standing there at the poll. He's standing there at the polls with one of his friends, a Gettysburg College graduate, David Hankey, a white man. And the two of them are working together. They're greeting each Black voter. They're handing them their ballot. They're making sure that they're organized. They get them inside, and they get them voting. As they're standing there, they see Jonas Johns with a wagon. They see Jonas Johns rolling up with his wagon, and they see him help every one of the men out of the wagon to go in and vote from the almshouse. Every one of the white men from the almshouse. Dave Hankey, standing next to Basil Biggs. These two men, Dave Hankey gets incensed. And the white man walks up to Jonas Johns. He knew him. He knew he was a Democrat. He knew he was fighting against Black voting rights. He was fighting against freedom. He starts screaming at him. And the reason he's screaming at him is because, well, Dave Hankey gave up a lot too. There's this amazing book called Battleground Adventures. It's an oral history of Civil War battlefields, and among them are Gettysburg. It's written by Cliff Johnson. And there's this amazing story in it. We don't know her name. It's the story of the colored servant maid. This Black woman on the morning of July 1st, as the battle is raining down on them, the Confederates start pushing into this farmhouse. She is a nanny. She works as a maid and a nanny for a widow. She cares for the 2 children in the house. This Black woman is standing there and realizes the house is now behind Confederate lines. She begs the woman she works for, help me, come on, we got to find something, we got to do something. And so they run. The 4 of them, 2 children, the woman and the Black woman, run across the fields. They run to Dave Hankey's house. They know they'll be safe there. They're running across the fields. The widow and the Black woman get to Dave Hankey's house. As they run towards it, there's Confederates in the dooryard. As this Black woman dives into the house, the Confederates outside are saying, she's mine. She's mine. We're seizing her. She's our property now. They want to turn this woman into a slave. She dives into the basement. She hides behind a wood pile. She piles stuff in front of her. She's trying desperately to hide. Dave Hankey, meanwhile, is up in the kitchen. He's been dealing with a Confederate officer who's on his kitchen table. And he says, listen, that Black woman that just ran through here, if I do everything I can for your men, if I keep you safe, if I take care of your wounds, if I keep them safe, if we cook for them, will you guarantee her freedom? And Confederate officer says, yeah, bring me a piece of paper. He writes out the orders on the piece of paper and it's handed out the door. The woman is free. Dave Hankey grabs a hammer and nails, and this white man hammers the door shut at the bottom. And they create basically a Dutch door. The top of it's open, the bottom of it's shut. And for the next 2.5 days, Dave Hankey and the widow and the children and the Black woman all work together. And they cook every bit of food that's handed in through that window, and they hand it back out to the Confederates. For 2.5 days, they are baking for her freedom. And it's not just baking the food they're giving them. Dave Hankey looks out the window and he sees that his prize calves are slaughtered. He sees his prize hogs are slaughtered, and the pieces of those animals are handed in, and he has to cook his own livestock to make sure that this woman is free. So as he's screaming at Jonas Johns in 1870, he's thinking about what he had to sacrifice to make sure that the Civil War came out how the Civil War came out. Behind him, Basil Biggs is standing there, gobsmacked that none of the Black voters are coming down from the almshouse. And finally, Jonas Johns just says, you want them? Go and get them. So Dave Hankey and Basil Biggs go and find a wagon. And they ride it up to the almshouse. And they go inside and they get every new Black voter out. And they put them in the wagon and they bring them down to the polling place. And among them is Otho Johnston. Otho Johnston steps out of the wagon. Basil Biggs holds his hand up and steadies him as he takes the step down. He's handed the ballot. He doesn't trust it. He doesn't trust the ballot. He wants to make sure. So he finds Lydia Watts nearby, who's a mixed race woman, a Black woman who has some white lineage as well. Hands her the ballot. She opens it up. She reads it aloud to him. He's satisfied. She doesn't say there's anything wrong with it, and he knows that she's not going to lead him astray. He takes it in and casts his ballot in the national election. Without Basil Biggs, without Dave Hankey, without those folks fighting, voting rights never would have happened in Gettysburg. We remember Basil Biggs for digging the graves, but there was so much more to these folks who lived through the battle and their descendants. So we're coming forward now. Things get more complex. America keeps growing and changing and shifting and becoming this weird place. We go to war again. We go to war in the Philippines. We go to war with Spain. And the Spanish-American War starts bringing America back together. Now, when I say bringing America back together, I really mean white America. It brings the white North and the white South together. The former Confederates and the former Federal soldiers start cooperating, start sharing reunions with each other. They start sharing the battlefield itself. But also, that war is an amazing opportunity for Black men. They once again have the opportunity to serve in the US military. And for many folks in the South, that was an opportunity to escape, to rise, to come up through the ranks to become more than just a sharecropper, more than just the son of a sharecropper, but to become something. In 1910, America was starting to mobilize, starting to figure out what a militia system and a National Guard system would look like. And Gettysburg was chosen on the East Coast as the place for all of those troops, all of those National Guardsmen to come together and organize and train. You see the headline here, 5,000 troops in camp. Virginia and Maryland militia arrive on special troop train. This is from the Gettysburg Times. 47 years ago today, the stern game of war was on in Gettysburg and the hills surrounding. Right on the battle anniversary in 1910, the trains roll in again, and soldiers from Virginia and Maryland have arrived. They set up a camp. Now, Marylanders haven't really raised a stink, but the Virginians have been spoiling for a fight since they found out about this camp. When the camp was first organized, when the camp was first created, they sent out a map to every one of the states with their campsite locations. Where would they be located? And the Virginians opened up the map and saw that their campsite was labeled Virginia, colored. They saw the map and they went, wait, are we going to be stationed with African-American troops? With black men? Are we going to be sitting tent by tent by tent beside black men, our white militia? That's completely outside the bounds of what we see as acceptable. They wired and telephoned the Pentagon. Well, the War Department at that point in time. They contact the War Department. They say, listen, this is not acceptable. And the governor gets the response, no, calm. That map is for the entire summer. You're the first troops that are there. Those troops from the District of Columbia, the African-American militiamen, they will be coming later. There will be no black soldiers in Gettysburg when you arrive. And that's how it's plastered across the Richmond newspapers. There will be no black soldiers in Gettysburg when you come. As the Virginians come off the trains, they start seeing an odd sight. There aren't any black militiamen in Gettysburg, but there are black soldiers. They're regular soldiers. They are regular soldiers. They are part of the United States military, particularly out of some training camps just outside of Washington, D.C., Fort Myer. They come up and they are here to train the militiamen. They are here to tell them how to be soldiers. So it's not just black men in uniform, it's black men in uniform who are supposed to be nominally instructing these white men. The Virginians go crazy. That smoldering fire, it's now flares up into a wildfire across this camp. And down in town, the bars go crazy. In one bar, some Virginia militiamen are standing at the bar. When one of those black soldiers comes in, he orders a beer. The barman pours in the beer. He grabs it off the bar, at which point one of the Virginia militiamen knocks it out of his hand. Well, he's not going to take that. They start throwing punches, and it rolls out into the street. And the black soldiers and the white men from the United States military that were with them start hurling bricks and throwing punches against the Virginians who are doing the same exact thing. And there's a rolling battle that happens downtown in the square in Gettysburg. Windows are broken, noses are bloody, no one's killed. Finally, peace is restored. The bars are closed. But there's these low levels of aggression, microaggressions, these moments where, well, black men start being cut off by white Virginians. Then at one point, a black man riding his horse down, I think it was York Street, riding down the street, and his horse strays a little bit and bumps into another horse, and it just so happens to be one of those Virginians. Virginia pulls out his pistol and smacks him across the face with it. It keeps going. It keeps going until finally, one black man steps over the line. It's an accidental line. It's a pretend line. It's an imaginary line. He did nothing wrong, really. The Virginians are at the edge of their camp. They're guarding that border of the edge of their camp. And they notice, or they say they notice, this black trooper from Fort Myers step over the edge of the line. He stepped into their camp by about a foot, and that was enough. Virginians say that they shouted halt. And then when the black man wouldn't halt, they fixed their bayonets, and 4 guards go charging after this black soldier in the United States military. You can see it right here. Lieutenant Ernest Hardy, Corporal J.E. Trueheart, both of Richmond. They charge after this man. Private Thomas Carroll is running for his life. He's running from these men who are screaming after him with loaded guns, with bayonets on the end, giant spikes, giant knives. They're about to run him through when finally someone steps in. Says, fine, we'll put him under arrest, but we'll put him under arrest at the US headquarters. Why? Private Thomas Carroll feared so much for his life in the hands of those white Virginians. He would only stay guarded by his comrades. Private Thomas Carroll knew war. He had fought in the Philippines. He had fought during the insurrection in the Philippines, during the invasion of the Philippines, depending on which side you're looking at it from. And then he came back to the United States and re-upped again, joined the military again and again and again and again. He had come from a sharecropping family in the South. He was escaping. And his most recent stint has been as a guard, and he's been guarding alongside instructors on tours of Civil War battlefields. For the past month before he got to Gettysburg, he's been at places like Chancellorsville. He's marched through Richmond. He's been with all these officers in training, standing as a black man next to white men learning. So Civil War landscapes are not odd to him. He's been over tons of them over the past month. And now at Gettysburg, he has his life threatened. The Virginians call for a court-martial. General Wotherspoon, who is in charge of the camp, starts to tamp it down. He won't hold a general court-martial. He eventually lets Carroll off with a slight fine. The Virginians go crazy, but there's not much they can do about it. Gettysburg is this toxic landscape. It's a landscape that bubbles and froths with this racism that underpins almost everything about it. And this picture, this outrageously striking picture, is one of the key artifacts of that bubbling. This picture is exactly what you think it is. That is a giant Ku Klux Klan rally held on the Gettysburg battlefield. You can tell it's the battlefield if you look in the background. You see above the tree line there, that cupola-looking thing. That is the Oak Ridge Observation Tower. It's up north of town. It got struck by lightning after 1925 and got chopped off halfway up. But that's the tower. And then you can see on the ridge there in the distance some of the monuments as well. This is the reunion of the Pennsylvania Ku Klux Klan in 1925 in September. And it's on that background that a giant fight breaks out in Gettysburg over a playground. Okay, I know that's weird. Like Klan and playground, don't worry, it'll make sense. You notice this article here on the front page of the Gettysburg Times. Kurt's grounds may be scrapped. Lack of support causes Mr. Kurtz to consider this action. The Kurtz playground was a really weird piece of ground. For those of you that love Gettysburg, or for those of you that haven't gotten here yet, Mr. G's Ice Cream down on Baltimore Street is at the front edge of what was Kurt's playground. It was a giant field. It had baseball diamonds on it. It had football fields. It had playground equipment. It had everything you could possibly imagine. And it was built by a man named William B. Kurtz. And it was named in honor of his grandfather. Kurtz is from Philadelphia. He's rich. And he comes to Gettysburg when he's a kid. and visits his grandfather and had such pleasant memories of Gettysburg. He wanted to give back to the community. And so in the 19-teens, he buys this chunk of ground and he creates a town park. But by the 1920s, they're out of cash. There's nothing in the operational budget. Kurtz didn't leave money, he left a park. And the borough doesn't own it. It's up to, a committee of locals, and the committee of locals hasn't been raising all that much money, and it's going to go belly up. Kurtz still owns the ground, by the way. He still owns the ground, and he just wanted them to upkeep it, and they're not doing it. And so Kurtz is threatening. He threatens to subdivide it, to cut it into pieces. One of the weird things about this playground, though, is that it's only open to certain chunks of Gettysburg. See this building right here? This is Franklin Street School. Gettysburg schools, of course, it's 1920. They're segregated. Gettysburg schools are segregated, and this is where all the Black students would attend classes. On the corner of Franklin and High Street, the northwest corner of the street. And next to this building is another playground. That's the playground that's open to the Black students. It's a postage stamp. It has a couple seesaws or a couple swings or something like that. It's nothing. It's not soccer fields. It's not baseball diamonds. It's not a proposed swimming pool. Kurtz got indignant. "I do not want to force an unwilling gift on anyone," said Mr. Kurtz in speaking on the subject. "You all know my object. If my ideas are wrong, say the word and we can scrap the place and charge it off in the experience account where so many of my plans are buried." This is from the Gettysburg Times coverage of exactly how angry Kurtz is that the town has spurned his park. Continuing, he said, "I built the playground for the use of the children and grandchildren of my old and dear friends in Gettysburg, believing that in doing so, I was making their lives happier and brighter and fitting them physically for their work." It sounds so beautiful and benevolent. This is taken from a letter he wrote to Gettysburg, basically threatening to take the park away. But then, a few days later, a chunk of that letter runs again. And this time, it has 2 new words in it. I'm going to read it again. From one of Mr. Kurtz's recent letters, these statements were read. "I built the playground for the use of the children and grandchildren of my old and dear white friends in Gettysburg, believing that in doing so, I was making their lives happier and brighter and fitting them physically for their work. I am fond of the colored people," he goes on, "have no race feeling against them, but do not believe in their social equality with the white races of our country. In a town like Gettysburg, I am sure that they cannot mix socially and that sooner or later there would be a clash and unpleasant consequences." Kurtz Park is intentionally, by its founder, racially segregated. And not just because it's the way of the land, but it's because it's this core belief how he views Gettysburg. There's one woman that doesn't sit well with. One woman that chafes against hard. Her name is Margaret Biggs. And if that last name sounds familiar, it is. Margaret Biggs is the daughter-in-law of Basil Biggs. She's married Basil's son, William, the daughter-in-law of the man who made sure that Black men could vote in Gettysburg, the man who reburied the United States soldiers who died at Gettysburg, is now fighting for integration. That the Gettysburg School Board cannot accept the Kurtz Memorial Park, maintain it by taxes, and at the same time draw the color line is the opinion of the Hand in Hand Club as expressed in an open letter to the Times. It's 1921. Margaret Biggs is writing this letter, a Black woman in Gettysburg, saying that segregation is wrong in 1921. Now, it wasn't a posted sign. It wasn't clear segregation. Here's what she writes in her letter. We were under the impression from the beginning it was for the public, but we, as colored people, soon found out different when our children were hunted out and compelled to leave the ground for no other reason than that their skins were black. Should the school board accept the playground, she continued, the taxpayers would all have a right to go there regardless of the color of their skin. And then I love this knife turn here. Taxation without representation is unconstitutional. Neither federal or state law can uphold it. The school board was going to take the grounds, not the borough. The borough realized they couldn't because they can't take a segregated facility. But the school board made this argument. There is a black playground in Gettysburg next to the Franklin Street School. Separate but equal is entirely acceptable in 1921. So as long as we give a pittance, just a handful of cash to the Hand in Hand Club who maintain that playground, we're absolved of our sin. So it goes through. School board buys the Kurtz grounds. They hold on to them, and they still hold them today. In fact, Gettysburg Area Middle School is built on the former site of the Kurtz playground, and one of the baseball fields right out in front is named Kurtz Memorial Field. This is what's lurking in Pennsylvania as Margaret Biggs writes that letter. I know that sounds really, really dramatic, right? There are Klansmen waiting. There are Klansmen lurking. You look at this picture, it's so shocking. Down there in the front, you can actually see some of those men, those older men, right down at the bottom of that picture, wearing those kind of Civil War looking hats. Those are most likely members of the Grand Army of the Republic, Civil War veterans, and Civil War veterans who fought for the United States military, not for the Confederacy. In fact, at the back of that band, you can actually see one of those men is holding a sign above his head that says Spirit of 1861. This is lurking all over Pennsylvania. From Pittsburgh to York, you were in a hotbed of Klan activity from 1921-22 all the way up through the 1930s. When the Klan comes to town, when this photo is taken, this is the front page of the Gettysburg Times. It is a special Ku Klux Klan edition of the Gettysburg Times. You look up in the upper corner and it says, "Good evening. Welcome to Gettysburg, heart of the new America, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan." Then look at how the town turned out. Town turns out by thousands to greet Klansmen. Applause given unstintingly by crowds on sidewalks as marchers pass. Ku Klux Klan presents gorgeous display in monster procession this afternoon. Many unique features demonstrated. Town decorated for Klan affair, on and on and on. The special Ku Klux Klan edition of the Gettysburg Times shows you just exactly the landscape. The men and women in Gettysburg were sitting. But it's not just Klansmen that are visiting. There's this great millennial and Generation Z saying of, show me the receipts, or I have the receipts. This is one of those cases where I literally have the receipts. What you're looking at there on the left is a list of the officers of the Gettysburg Clavern of the Ku Klux Klan in 1924, a year before this photograph was taken. You notice at the top there, Reverend Harry Daniels. He was the pastor of the Methodist Church. You keep going down this list and you can find movers and shakers in a lot of different industries in Gettysburg. These documents are so deep. Joshua Bain there, he was actually a battlefield guide, licensed battlefield guide. If you came to Gettysburg and you wanted to tour the battlefield, you had to worry that the man who was showing you around in the evening put a hood on and burned a cross. And another robe report. This is actually a robe order form. And right there, the second name on the list you see is Pinckney Hess. And the Hess brothers, there were three of them that were in the Gettysburg Clavern. were Pinckney Hess, Selmer Hess, and Seabrook Hess, 3 white men. Pinckney and Selmer and Brooke headed out in particular for one family in Gettysburg, Charles Miller, and his brother, Steve Boardley. Boardley and Miller both lived in a set of apartments along Racehorse Alley. Boardley ran a barber shop and also was a bootlegger. He sold bathtub gin out of his barber shop. And the Hesses were some of his best customers. There's a day in 1926, when the Hess brothers come in to buy some liquor. And they're told there isn't any. And then Charles Miller's son, who just so happens to be in his uncle's barbershop, tells them off. A young black man in his teens tells off 3 young white men. They vow revenge. That night, they come back. They don't break into the barbershop. They break into Charles Miller's house. They break into the kitchen. They pour into the kitchen these 3 men. They tell the courts later on that they were searching for bootleggers. They were searching for bootleggers. Why didn't they go into the barbershop? But nonetheless, that's their defense. They break in, and Charles and Ralph Miller hear the commotion. They run out into the kitchen. They see these 3 men breaking into their house, and they start throwing their fists. And there's a brawl that happens right inside the house. The Hess brothers run out, noses bloodied, beat to pulp. The Millers do really well in this fight. Charles Miller is incensed. He knows exactly who these guys are. They've hung out at his brother's barbershop. He's done with this. He goes down and he marches out. And he goes to Judge J.U. Appler. And he swears out a warrant for their arrest. He wants to press charges. He wants to press charges for assault and battery. And so the constable goes and arrests the 3 Hess brothers. 3 Hess brothers come into the courthouse, and they immediately plead, and they say, hey, we want to swear out charges for assault and battery against both of the Millers. The Hesses, the gavel drops, and they are given $50 each as bail. And then the constable goes out and arrests the Millers. Charles and Ralph are brought in. Each one is assessed with a fine, with a bail of $200, $400 total dollars for the family. The Hesses, $50 each. The Millers, $200 each. The family can't find enough cash to bail both of them out. They bail out Charles, and they have to go to the community and scrape together more money to bail Ralph out. The Hesses are let off with a fine. Charles Miller dies before there was a trial. And I can't figure out what happened to Ralph. But it's plain as day. These 3 men that joined the Klan have it out for Gettysburg's black community. You run down these lists of names. You start finding random people. M.T. Cluck, who there is the exalted Cyclops of the Klan. He actually was the first overhire in the Gettysburg Police Department's history. Up until the 1920s, there was only 1 police officer in Gettysburg. They decided they needed 2. He was the 2nd police officer hired in Gettysburg, the leader of Gettysburg's Ku Klux Klan. It's striking when you see Klan letterhead like that, and then the masthead there reads Gettysburg, PA, December 1924. That's the landscape that Margaret Biggs wrote that letter in. When she said the color line was unfair, when she said that place should not be segregated, she knew the town she lived in. She died before anything could happen to her. She died a couple years after she wrote that letter. The Klan never came for her, although it's a different story we'll share another time. They did come for her husband, William Biggs. But she stood up. She showed gumption in the face of unstinted hate. She's an amazing hero. And then there's this man, Dwight David Eisenhower. We're in the 1950s now. Gettysburg seems to have changed, as does the country. World War's over. By the way, this man commanded one of the Hess brothers during that World War. Pinckney Hess joined the United States military. He was part of the Greatest Generation, that former Klansman. And when he died in the 1970s, he was buried in Gettysburg National Cemetery. We usually think of history as these chunks of time that are broken up into discrete things we can study in chapters of a textbook, but it's all mixed together. And by the 1950s, Gettysburg is the same exact Gettysburg it was in the 1920s, is the same exact Gettysburg it was in the 1880s, is the same exact Gettysburg it was in the 1860s. Eisenhower moving here doesn't change that much. In 1959, near the end of his presidency, this is after Little Rock. This is after, ostensibly, from a public view, Eisenhower has been fighting for civil rights. This is a letter that gets penned to the president. It's from a man named Samuel Cochran. He lives, as you can see on the piece of letterhead there, in St. Albans, New York. Yeah, I had to look it up. Actually, St. Albans is just next to Jamaica, Queens. So this is in one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. He writes a letter to the president. And it's an amazing, amazing letter. Amazing life story. And it has to do with these, well, the one place that's in these 2 pictures right here. If you visited Gettysburg at all ever, driven down Steinway Avenue, you might actually have stayed in this hotel. Gettysburg Motor Lodge. It's still there. It's across from the Gettysburg Heritage Center, across from Appalachian Brewing Company, right there along the main drag. Same exact hotel today as it was back then. Dear Mr. President, Cochran wrote, may I call your attention to the practices of segregation taking place in the town you call home, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Eisenhower had chosen Gettysburg as his home. He had chosen it partially because he had been here in the 19-teens during World War I. He had come here and found welcome, found respite. And so when it came time after the war to figure out where he wanted to live, Gettysburg sounded pretty good. Cochran writes to Eisenhower about a visit he took to Gettysburg. He had sent a telegram ahead of time to the Gettysburg Motor Lodge, had paid put a down payment down on a hotel room, wants to visit Gettysburg with his wife. Got a telegram back that said, yep, we got your reservation, you're good to go, come on down for your trip. It's like going to Priceline today. He got the confirmation email in his box and he was ready to go. You can see it here in his letter. Reservations were made at the Gettysburg Motor Lodge for myself and Mrs. Cochran, and confirmation of the reservation received. Upon our arrival there, we were told the lodge was filled up and they were unable to accommodate us, but would get reservations for us at the Colton Motel. The clerk working at the Motor Lodge sees this black man and woman come through the door and immediately realizes that something has gone very wrong. And so he turns, picks up the phone, and calls the Colton Motel just down the street. And Cochran stands there and listens to the conversation. The clerk has a conversation on the phone about can you, we don't have any room, can you? And then he sends him, gives him directions. It's just a few doors down. The Colton Motel, the building is still there today. Cochran gets in the car with his wife. They drive up the street. They get to the Colton. They walk in the door. And the clerk at the Colton goes, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't get any phone call. Cochran, shocked. It's like, what? I don't know what's happening here. He goes back to the Gettysburg Motor Lodge. He goes back into the first clerk. He goes up to the first clerk and says, listen, what happened? You said you called the Colton. He said doesn't have any space either. And the clerk goes, oh, I'm sorry. I must have, it's the home sweet home. It's down the other end of the street here. Just go down to that one. That's where I called. So Cochran, again, he's starting to realize white clerk, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He's not in Jamaica, Queens anymore. 2 black people getting the runaround. He goes down to that other hotel, and sure enough, the clerk says, I didn't get any phone call. We went again to the lodge, he wrote to Eisenhower, and found a filled sign had been placed in the door. And after we had gone on the wild goose chase, no excuses were made. I was told it was just one of those unfortunate things. Filled up. No room. That's it. Gettysburg basically said, we don't want you. Due to the humiliation and embarrassment of being refused lodging because of one's race and color, pictures were not taken. Samuel Cochran's a youth minister in his church. The children that come to his Sunday school have been asking about this place called Gettysburg, partially because the battle happened there, partially because Lincoln spoke there, partially because Eisenhower now lives there. And he knew that he couldn't get all of his Sunday school kids down to Gettysburg. So instead, he brought an 8mm camera and his wife. They were going to take stills, they were going to take film, and bring it back home to New York to show these kids this place where freedom was won and where the president lived. Because of one's race and color, the pictures were not taken. Gettysburg was obviously not about freedom. I wish to thank you, sir, he wrote the president, for taking a moment of your busy day to read this letter. It is our hope, as is yours, that men all over the world someday will be really free. Yours truly, very, very truly yours, Samuel J. Cochran. It is our hope, as it is yours, that men all over the world someday will be really free. It's an amazing sentiment. 1959. It's not long ago. It's spitting distance from where we are today. Gettysburg echoes with these things. Moments when we've refused to accept people, moments when we've accepted people that you might not expect, and moments when, beyond all else, the local Black community and the stalwart Black visitors have tried to stand up for their rights. Say, no, this place is not a white place. This place belongs to us as well. This is a place where everyone should be really free. Gettysburg is a fascinating town. It shook Lincoln's hand. And there's a code of honor among people that shook Lincoln's hand. It's one that we, even today, still have to live up to. Thank you, folks, for joining me. And I have not been able to see the chat, so I have no clue what questions have come in, but I'm sure there are amazing ones waiting me as soon as I click the stop sharing button. So I'm so excited to have been here with you guys tonight, and thank you so much. Awesome. So what questions do we have? Hop into the chat box there. Shantanique and Amanda are going to help as well.
Yep. Does anybody have any questions for John? It was very informative. Thank you.
Lots of claps. That's awesome. Thank you.
Yep. Let's see.
Brittany says, I've never been taught this in grade school. So that's one of those. History is written by the victors, and we still have racism. So the victors are still writing the books. And one of the ways we need to get this out there is flip the script. And so I'm writing a book right now on race in Gettysburg, Brittany, and it's just as much a book about the white folks in Gettysburg as the black folks, because it's about all of those folks that intentionally threw things under the rug. The Klan, from the Klansmen to local churches who wrote petitions to bar black visitors from getting off trains. That's a whole nother story. There's tons more stories, obviously. But yeah, it's one of those things where you feel like you've been lied to when you start finding this stuff.
Next question from Kathy. Any record of Eisenhower response?
That one is its own can of worms too. So that letter, I got that out of the Eisenhower Presidential Library's collection through a database we have through the college of civil rights documents. And it's in there because it was responded to by E. Frederick Morrow. E. Frederick Morrow is the only black man who works in Eisenhower's White House. Eisenhower had exactly one black man who worked in a professional role in his White House, and he wrote a response. Basically, by 1959, every letter about civil rights was ending up on Morrow's desk, and he had to respond to every single one of them. And the thing he writes in response is great. Morrow had been to Gettysburg. He had visited Ike at the farm. He had been here in the 1940s and spoke at the college for an NAACP event. So I mean, he knows Gettysburg decently, and he knows the situation here. And he says, listen, the president's not going to respond on a personal matter like this. But if I were you, I would call the NAACP and get yourself a lawyer, because this can't hold. I can't find any evidence of a case being, levied against the motel, but yeah, there is a response from the administration, but not from Eisenhower himself. I don't even know if Ike ever actually saw the letter. It's the way it goes in presidential administrations. Chris has a really good, okay, Chris, Chris asks, what is the role of Gettysburg in the Underground Railroad? For my master's thesis, I wrote on the Underground Railroad in upstate New York. And one of the things that surprised me when I was researching that was the fact that the Underground Railroad is not secret at all. Like, it's outrageously simple to find all of the data you need to prove that the Underground Railroad happened, and what it did, and the names of people that were carried on it, and just all of the details are there. And I have not seen a source that has that vivid detail of Gettysburg's Underground Railroad history. It may exist, and I am waiting to be proven wrong, and I'm excited to be proven wrong, because that's what every historian should be. But right now, I'm really skeptical about the Underground Railroad in Gettysburg, because it's wafer thin in terms of sources. Whereas in many other places, I can tell you the names of people who came through those stops, and the dates they came through, and the routes they took. Until we find that type of text, and maybe it's out there, and I'd be super excited to see it, I'm still skeptical. I'm still skeptical of exactly how deep it was.
Next question comes from Logan. What is the National Park Service doing currently to share some of these stories?
So I work with the training division of the Park Service. So I teach people how to tell cool stories. So it's tough for me to get the cool stories out there. But the park in Gettysburg has been doing a lot of work around Basil Biggs. They're restoring the James Warfield House. Their focus is a little more myopically on July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 1863, and November of 1863. Whereas I'm looking, broader at the Civil War memory stuff. So they're focusing more on how did a black farmer survive during the battle, that type of thing. And so they're not getting out there as much. But hey, anybody from the parks out there, you want me to come and chat, I'm more than welcome to. And I'm already on the payroll most of the time. So all you have to do is pick up the phone or drop an email.
The next question is from Kathy. She read in the Gettysburg Times article dated in 1963 that the federal employees were coming to town to make sure the town businesses weren't segregated. People I've interviewed said that many businesses, such as the barber shops, were segregated. What was the color line for businesses in the 60s? That businesses weren't segregated leading up to the battle, Sentinel.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So the stuff that I've looked into is actually the state Pennsylvania Human Rights Commission, which has some great records up in Harrisburg. I've been looking for the case files because the newspaper coverage and then their newsletter coverage says there was only one business that wouldn't comply with hanging a poster that said, we seat everybody equally. I can't figure out what business it was, and I really just want to know. In terms of the barbershops, it's actually the reason that there was a barbershop on campus was partially because the barbershops in town had signs in their windows that said, "We do not cut Negro hair." So there was a strict color line in barbershops. There were a couple of off-license barbershops that were run by the Black community in the Third Ward. Basically, somebody without a cosmetology license who's cutting hair in his basement. Or in the kitchen, I'm just on a kitchen chair. That was happening. Most of the women in town actually had to go all the way down to, from the folks I've interviewed, had to go all the way down to Rockville to find someone to do their hair. So it would be a day's trip, and you'd pile as many of the girls in the car as possible. You'd go down to Rockville to the salon. You'd spend the day at the salon and come on back. So yeah, there's all of these tidbits that you can find, but then there's also this shame that exists around it. And I'm glad there's shame that exists around it. But particularly in the white community, when I go in and I'm like, hey, you remember any segregated businesses? Usually they clam up and go, no, don't. It took me forever to figure out which one of the barbershops a student staged a sit-in in the spring of 1964. Philip Parson, Snuffy Parson, a member of Teak, staged a sit-in what was then Diener's Barbershop and is now Town and Campus Barbershop. It was across the street at that point in time. But yeah, Phil Parsons staged a sit-in that barbershop to try to get them to cut hair. And they gave him a really, really bad haircut. And he walked back into his frat house and said, it's the last time that I'm going to try to fight for this put my hair on the line. So yeah, it's the segregation story in Gettysburg. I have found bits and pieces, Kathy, but it's tough to find everything. Because there is that note of shame that's rightfully associated with it, especially within living memory. So Chris, do you remember what period you remember hearing about the encampment outskirts of town? Like, is that Civil War period? Is it post-war? Because you might be thinking about Yellow Hill. Which was a small black enclave that was up with the Quaker community north of town. Yeah, then yes, it's Yellow Hill. So there was a basically a small black town back in a hollow up among the Quakers in North Adams County, and it was a black enclave. They had a church, had a set of houses there. And actually, it's probably where during the battle, a lot of Gettysburg's black community ran to escape. Basically get into the backwoods so the Confederates can't find you.
All right, so we have one final question. Is there any of Edward Hopkins' homes still in Gettysburg today, or has it been removed?
So Ed Hopkins lived with his mother, Julia, after his father died. His father, Jack Hopkins, died in 1867. And so Ed Hopkins and Julia Hopkins, his mom, lived together. When they were on the campus, they lived inside of a house that was north of Pennsylvania Hall. It was between Pennsylvania Hall and the library. And right now that's just an open quad. The building was knocked down. It actually was a converted bathhouse that they had turned into a perk. Obviously, when his father dies, they move out of that house, but they also owned a house down on South Washington Street that is still there. It's not in the best repair. It needs a lot of work on it. I'm hoping somebody buys it that will love it someday. It is, if you drive down South Washington Street, if you're driving south, it's on the right-hand side, just beyond High Street. It has this god-awful green siding on the outside that is not from the Civil War, but it's the god-awful green siding house there on the right-hand side. That's Jack Hopkins's house, and then that's where Julia lived with her son as he was fighting for Black rights in the Third Ward. Oh, Chris has a really great question there, Shantanique and Amanda.
Chris says, as a friend of the college, where can he get information on future lectures and such? Do you want to answer that, or would you like me?
I think you guys can tell them what's coming up on OME's calendar and kind of where to look for all this kind of stuff.
Right. So I know that the Eisenhower Institute is doing, I think it's like a seminar. I had added that information onto the email that I sent today. Also, we are doing First Fridays, but we only have one more, but it's more about school year, but we may do more racism talks. Joe Lynch, oh, she was saying your dad wasn't. I thought he was giving us information.
Well, Joe actually, Joe does an alumni newsletter that, even though you're a friend of the college, Chris, I am so excited. I bet you Joe would love to add you to that alumni newsletter, and I know that a lot of these things that's where this went out on that as well. So that's another place to go. Shauna's saying some featured events on the college homepage.
Right.
As well as the digest, you can always follow like all the LME and club and organization social media pages. A lot of the events will be posted via Facebook and things like that. If you can, I'm sure, like he said, Joe can add you to the alias so that you can receive some of the alumni newsletters. And if you send us our emails, your email, we can add you to possibly some of our alias as well to send you some of the events that we have.
Yeah, there's always amazing stuff that's going on the campus. And we love having folks from the community come on in and join in too. It's part of what we do for Gettysburg. I mean, Gettysburg College isn't just for Gettysburg College, it's for Gettysburg. It's for the whole place. And that's one of the amazing things about this, is that by finding news stories like this, and thank you guys, thank you Shantanique and Amanda and Monique for inviting me in for this too, is because when we find news stories like this and we can share them, it means that we can help fix things too, and help Gettysburg keep getting better. When we look at the past, we can find heroes and use those heroes as inspiration.
Well, thank you, John, for coming and doing this evening. This will be, this is being recorded. So for anyone, we will resend it out to everybody that had registered for the event in case they missed it, but also for you all who are here and maybe, want to rewatch it, it'll be there and hopefully maybe available on the cupola. And yeah, so thank you again for coming.
And I just wanted to say, if anybody wants to know my footnotes or needs more information, or you're coming to Gettysburg, you need a research topic and you want to plumb into my research files, that's cool. My email is john.m.rudy@gmail.com, and that comes direct to me. And if I don't reply, hit me again, because I'm terrible with email. So,
which I am going to type that right now and put it in the chat.
Yeah, if you're ever going, hey, I need something to research and I'm really interested in Black history, let me know. John. Yep.
Yeah, I missed it.
Yep, you're fine.
Like that.
There we go.
There you go.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. And I was so excited to be here. And I'm so glad that you guys have been doing the First Friday events too. So this is great.
Great. Thank you.
John,
see you guys around campus.